Clara Whitcomb pressed her back against the cold hallway wall, a tea tray balanced in both hands, and heard the sentence that killed everything she had been trying not to feel. I will never love again. Not for any woman alive. She did not drop the tray. She did not make a sound. She simply stood there while something inside her chest folded itself up and went very, very quiet. If you've ever loved someone who didn't know it, subscribe to this channel. Drop the name of your city in the comments and stay with Clara until the very last word. The summer of 1816 had no right to be that beautiful. That was the thought Clara Whitcomb carried with her every morning. She walked the grounds of Reedmont Estate, that the Hudson Valley had no business blooming that hard, that green, that generous, when her own life had arranged itself into something so narrow and so careful. The roses along the east fence were an offense. The way the river caught the early light was almost cruel. Beauty like that belonged to women with choices. Clara had learned by 26 that she was not one of them. She had come to Reedmont 6 weeks ago on the strength of a letter her father wrote before he died, a letter of character addressed to Mrs. Abigail Reed, asking if the family might find use for a young woman of education and good sense. Clara could read Latin. She could teach French conversation, basic arithmetic, and proper correspondence. She could manage a household inventory, supervise a child's lessons, and sit with an elderly woman through the long hours of a summer afternoon without growing restless or resentful. What the letter did not say was that Clara was proud. Quietly, stubbornly, inconveniently proud. She had told herself on the wagon ride north from Pennsylvania that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. She told herself the same thing every morning when she pinned her hair and checked her reflection and reminded her own eyes in the mirror, "You are here to work, not to want." For 5 weeks, it had almost been true. Then she had met Nathaniel Reed. Not met him the way a woman meets a man at a dance or across a supper table with introductions and pleasantries. She had simply existed in the same house as him, and that had been enough to do considerable damage. He was 34, a widower. Former captain in the militia, the kind of man whose stillness in a room told you he had learned stillness the hard way in places where noise got people killed. He had a hard jaw and quiet eyes, and he spoke rarely enough that when he did speak, everyone in the house turned slightly toward the sound, the way sunflowers follow light without meaning to. Clara had told herself she was not doing that. She had been doing exactly that. She had noticed when he read. She had noticed when he didn't eat. She had noticed the way he stood at the west window some evenings, looking out toward the river, like he was expecting someone to come back who never would. She had noticed the small scar above his left brow, and had wondered privately what had put it there. She had told herself that was professional observation, that she was simply paying attention to the household. She was lying, and she knew it. 6 weeks. That was all it had taken. 6 weeks of careful distance and deliberate politeness, and Clara Whitcomb, who had buried her father, managed her family's debts, and packed her whole life into a single trunk without shedding a tear in front of anyone, had gone and developed feelings for a man who had made it clear to everyone in every quiet, disciplined way a man could that he was not available for feelings. She had not acted on it. She was not a fool. She had simply allowed herself the private harmlessness of caring about someone from a respectful distance, the way you allow yourself to admire a painting you know you can never own. That was what she had told herself. On a Tuesday afternoon in late July, Clara carried a tea tray down the main corridor toward the east sitting room, where Mrs. Reed usually received guests after noon. The hallway was long and dim, even in summer, the kind of old house that held its cool proudly, the wood floors creaking their familiar protests under her feet. She had learned which boards to step around. She had learned the whole rhythm of this house in 6 weeks, its silences, its schedules, its unspoken rules. She was 3 steps from the sitting room door when she heard his voice. Low, deliberate. The voice of a man who had decided something a long time ago and was simply restating it for the record. "I have no intention of remarrying Mother. I said it in January. I am saying it again now." Clara stopped walking. She did not mean to stop. Her feet simply ceased to cooperate. Mrs. Reed's voice came through the door, gentle and slightly tired. "Nathaniel, I am not suggesting you forget Eleanor. I am suggesting that it has been 3 years. 3 years is not the subject. Then what is the subject? A pause. The kind of pause that has weight in it. I buried love with her, Nathaniel said. It is gone. I am not looking to dig that grave back open for any woman living or yet to be born. What I feel now is sufficient. I work this land. I manage this house. I sleep without dreaming. That is enough. That is more than enough. Clara's hands tightened on the tray handles. You sleep without dreaming, Mrs. Reed repeated, and the way she said it made it sound like an indictment rather than a statement. Yes, that is not peace, my son. That is absence. I prefer it. Another pause. Longer this time. The Ellison girl will be visiting Friday? Mrs. Reed said, her voice changing shape, becoming careful navigating something. Margaret, her mother has written. I know. She is a good match by every measure society would name. Then society is welcome to marry her. Nathaniel, I am not unkind to women, mother. I am simply honest with them. I will not offer what I do not have to give. A woman who marries me expecting love will be disappointed. I have nothing left of that to spend. The finality in his voice was not cruel. That was the thing that made it worse. It was not angry or cold or dismissive. It was simply settled the way a man sounds when he has made peace with an amputation. Clara stood in the corridor for 5 full seconds. Then she turned around, walked back to the kitchen, set the tea tray down on the table, and stood very still with her hands flat against the wooden surface, looking at nothing. Miss Whitcomb. The kitchen girl, young Dottie, looked up from the pot she was stirring. Weren't that for Mrs. Reed? I forgot something, Clara said. I'll take it directly. She waited until Dottie looked back down at her pot. Then she pressed her eyes shut, breathed in through her nose, and said to herself, to the foolish, hopeful, inconvenient part of herself that had been quietly building something in the dark for 6 weeks without her full permission, stop. Just that. One word. Stop. She picked up the tray and walked back down the corridor. She knocked at the sitting room door. She entered when Mrs. Reed called for her. She set the tea down with a steady hand and a pleasant expression, and she did not look at Nathaniel Reed once. She did not look at him once. He was standing near the window. She was aware of that. The way you are aware of a fire in a room, peripherally with your body, rather than your eyes. She thanked Mrs. Reed for the afternoon's instructions. She excused herself with a small, appropriate curtsy. She walked out. And that was the moment Clara Whitcomb made a decision. She was not going to be a woman who pined. She was not going to be a woman who waited. She was not going to be a woman who let her face give her away every time a man walked into the room. She was here to work. She was here to earn her keep and send what she could to her brother Samuel and survive with dignity until she could afford to build something of her own. Nathaniel Reed's heart, or the absence of it, was none of her professional concern. She would be polite. She would be correct. She would do her job with excellence, and she would feel absolutely nothing. It lasted about 4 hours. By supper, she had it mostly managed. She sat at the lower end of the table, where the household staff of her rank typically ate, and she ate her food and answered when spoken to and kept her eyes on her plate when she heard him come through the door of the adjoining dining room where the family took their meals. She heard him ask Dottie where the bread had gone. She heard Dottie giggle and say it was still in the oven, sir, just another minute. She heard him say, "Reckon I can wait," in that flat, quiet way of his, a faint remnant of the years he'd spent in the field among men who talked economy and speed, and the sound of it did something inconvenient to her chest that she addressed immediately by taking a very deliberate bite of her potato. She could do this. She had done harder things. The next morning she began in earnest, where before she had allowed herself the small permission of meeting Nathaniel's gaze across the breakfast table. She now found reasons to enter and exit rooms before he arrived or after he left. Where she had once answered his occasional questions about her reading, he had noticed the book she carried and asked about it once 2 weeks ago, a conversation that had lasted 12 minutes and that she had replayed an embarrassing number of times, since she now kept her book closed, and her answers brief and redirected. When he asked her at noon on Wednesday whether she had managed to finish the novel Mrs. Reed had lent her, she said yes, sir, and nothing more. He waited a moment, like he expected her to continue. She did not continue. "Did you enjoy it?" he asked. "It was well written." Another pause. "That's not an answer, Miss Whitcomb." "I apologize. It was a satisfying story. Excuse me, I believe I heard Mrs. Reed calling." Mrs. Reed had not called. But Mrs. Reed was gracious enough when Clara appeared at her sitting room door 30 seconds later with an expression of absolute professional composure to invent a need for her assistance that kept her occupied for the rest of the afternoon. Mrs. Abigail Reed was 71 years old, sharp as new glass, and had been watching human beings arrange and destroy themselves for long enough to recognize a woman in retreat when she saw one. She said nothing for 3 days. On the 4th day, a Thursday, she asked Clara to sit with her on the back porch after the child's lessons were done, a porch that faced the south garden with its long rows of summer vegetables and the distant line of the tree where the land met the sky in a clean green edge. "You are very efficient lately," Mrs. Reed said. Clara folded her hands in her lap. "Thank you, ma'am." It wasn't a compliment. Clara looked at her. Mrs. Reed was watching the garden with an expression that was kind and extremely inconvenient. "You were warmer when you first arrived. You used to laugh at supper. Last week you laughed at something Thomas said. Thomas, who is 9 years old and has not yet learned that the things he says are funny. This week you smile with your mouth only." "I am perfectly well, Mrs. Reed." "I did not ask if you were well. I said you were efficient." The old woman turned to look at her. "A woman can survive loneliness, my dear. It is a skill we are all trained in from birth, whether we ask to be or not. But I have watched women mistake loneliness for virtue, and it is always a shame. They armor themselves in propriety and call it dignity, and they lose the very warmth that made them worth knowing in the first place." Clara said nothing. "Whatever you heard," Mrs. Reed said quietly, "or whatever you decided, I am not asking you to undo it. I am only asking you to be careful not to erase yourself in the process." The words landed somewhere soft. Clara pressed her hands tighter together in her lap. "I am only trying to behave properly, ma'am." Mrs. Reed turned back to the garden. "My son uses the same word. Properly. As though propriety were something a person could live inside of like a house." She paused. "It is more like a fence, Clara. Useful in some places, but a fence is meant to mark a border, not to lock a person in." Clara held very still. "You may go," Mrs. Reed said not unkindly, "but think about what I said." She thought about it. She thought about it while she supervised young Thomas's Latin conjugations, and while she helped Dottie sort the linen inventory, and while she sat alone in her small room in the East Wing at 11 o'clock at night, with a candle burning low and a book open in her lap that she had not actually read a single page of in 40 minutes. She thought about it, and then she told herself that Mrs. Reed, for all her sharpness, did not know what Clara knew. Did not know what Clara had heard. Did not know that the decision had already been made for her, not by Clara, not by circumstance, but by the man himself in his own words, in his own voice, in a hallway where he had not known anyone was listening. "I have nothing left of that to spend." He had said it clearly. He had meant it. A man who sounds like that does not turn around 6 weeks later because a school teacher's daughter from Pennsylvania stopped making conversation at supper. That was not how the world worked. Clara had read enough novels to know the difference between a romantic convention and a trap. She was not going to mistake her own feelings for a story. She was going to be professional. She was going to be useful. She was going to endure. She did not see Nathaniel alone for 4 days after that. The estate was large enough in summer that it was possible to move through the house and grounds on a schedule that barely overlapped with his. She had perfected the art of it. She knew when he rode out to inspect the south fields in the morning between 7 and 9 reliably, and when he returned. She knew he took his evening meal late, usually after 8. She knew he spent his afternoons in the study with the account books, and she had adjusted Thomas's afternoon lesson location to the North Library accordingly. She was organized. She was thorough. She was, as Mrs. Reed had noted, very efficient. She was also aware with a precise and miserable clarity of every single time she managed to avoid him, because each avoidance required her to know exactly where he was. She could not tell if that was ironic or simply exhausting. On a Friday afternoon, she was crossing through the main hall with Thomas's geography books tucked under one arm and a list of household needs for the market in the other hand, and she turned a corner and walked directly into Nathaniel Reed. Not metaphorically, physically. The books went sideways. The list went to the floor. She caught herself against the wall, and he caught the books reflexively, one hand out, and for a moment they were both standing there in the narrow hall with about 14 inches between them and her heart doing something she had explicitly instructed it to stop doing. "I beg your pardon," she said immediately. "I was not attending. No harm." He looked at the books in his hand, a youth's geography of the United States. "Thomas giving you trouble with the state maps again?" "He is improving." She held out her hand for the books. He did not hand them back immediately. He looked at her that quiet, unhurried way he had of looking at people as though he had nowhere else to be and no interest in pretending otherwise. She was aware of the color in her face. She could do nothing about it. "Are you well, Miss Whitcomb?" he said. "Perfectly, thank you. You seem—" He stopped. Something moved across his expression that she could not read. "Never mind." "The books, please, Mr. Reed. I have a lesson at 2. He handed them back. His fingers did not brush hers. She was not relieved by that. She was not anything by that. She thanked him, retrieved her list from the floor, and walked away with her spine straight and her pace even and her face arranged into an expression of complete professional calm. She did not look back. Behind her, she heard nothing. No footsteps following. No voice calling after her. She told herself that was exactly what she had wanted. Yang. That evening after supper, Clara sat in the small parlor where she was permitted to read in the evenings, a room at the back of the house, modest, practical, furnished with one good chair and a lamp, and she opened her book and read the same paragraph 7 times. Outside through the window, she had cracked for the summer air, she could hear the estate settling into night. Crickets building their wall of sound, the horses shifting in the distant stable. Somewhere toward the south field, a dog barking twice and going quiet, and then closer boots on the porch boards. She did not look up. The boots stopped outside her window. "Miss Whitcomb!" His voice. She had gotten so careful about avoiding the sound of it at close range that it still managed at 10 feet's distance, through a cracked window, to do something she was no longer going to name. She looked up. Nathaniel Reed was standing on the porch, hat in hand, looking at her through the window with an expression that was not quite anything she had seen on him before. Not the careful stillness, not the polite distance. Something else. Something less managed. "Forgive me," he said. "I don't mean to disturb you." "You are not disturbing me," she said, because it was the correct thing to say. "You've been avoiding me," he said. She kept her voice entirely level. "I have been attending to my duties. You walked a quarter mile out of your way this morning to keep from passing me in the East Garden." She said nothing. "I noticed," he said, not accusing, just stating it. The way a man states a fact he has been sitting with long enough to decide it needs to be spoken aloud. "I apologize if I gave any impression of—" "I'm not asking for an apology." He turned the hat over in his hands once. "I'm asking what I did." The question was so direct, so plainly spoken, that it took her a moment. She had prepared for a great many things in the last week. She had not prepared for sincerity. "You did nothing," she said carefully. "You have been entirely correct in your behavior, Mr. Reed, as have I." "That's not an answer either." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at her book. "Good evening, Mr. Reed." A long pause. She did not look up. She heard him exhale once quiet through his nose. "Good evening, Miss Whitcomb." His boots retreated across the porch. She listened until she could not hear them anymore. Then she sat very still in her chair, with her book open in her lap and her hands not quite steady, and she told herself for what felt like the 100th time since that Tuesday afternoon in the hallway that she had done the right thing. She told herself it would get easier. She told herself convincingly enough that she almost believed it, that a woman who protected herself from pain she could see coming was a woman with sense, and she turned the page of the book she had not read a single word of. Outside, the summer night pressed itself against the windows, warm and indifferent and blooming. Regardless, the way beautiful things always do, whether anyone is watching or not. She stopped laughing on a Saturday. That was the detail that broke Nathaniel Reed's concentration more than anything else had in 3 years. He had not expected it to matter. He had spent the better part of a week telling himself that Clara Whitcomb's moods were none of his business, that whatever had shifted in her behavior was likely personal and private and entirely unconnected to him, and that a man who had deliberately, consciously, and out loud told his own mother he wanted nothing to do with emotional entanglement had no right to stand at a window watching a woman cross the yard and wonder why she no longer looked up. He stood at the window anyway. She was walking with Thomas, the boy's geography book open in her hands, pointing at something on the page while Thomas walked beside her with his hands in his pockets, scuffing his boots. And Thomas said something Nathaniel couldn't hear what, and Clara smiled the way she had smiled in her first weeks at Reedmont, the way that reached her eyes and changed the whole geometry of her face. And for 1 second, Nathaniel thought, there she is. And then Thomas laughed too loud and startled a bird from the fence. And Clara flinched, and the smile became polite again, managed again, and she looked back down at the book. Nathaniel turned from the window. He picked up his pen. He looked at the column of figures in the account ledger. He put the pen down. He had been doing this for 4 days. The accounts were suffering. He pushed back from the desk, stood up, and went to find his mother. She was in the east sitting room with her embroidery, which she had been working on for 3 years, and showed no particular ambition to finish. And she looked up when he came in with the expression of a woman who had been expecting a visit, and was mildly interested to see how long it had taken. "Sit down," she said. "You're making the room feel crowded." He sat. "The Ellison girl arrives today," his mother said, not looking up from her embroidery. "In case you had forgotten." "I hadn't. Her mother is coming with her. Mrs. Ellison will want a tour of the South Garden." A pause. "You could send Clara to accompany them." "I could." "That would also keep Clara occupied and out of whatever it is you are currently doing with your face." Nathaniel looked at his mother. She bit a thread off with great composure and did not meet his eye. "I am not doing anything with my face," he said. "You are doing a great deal with your face, Nathaniel. You have been doing it since Wednesday. I am old, not blind." She set the embroidery in her lap finally, and looked at him with the particular directness she had never in 71 years bothered to soften. "She is a good woman." "I know that." "She is also proud. The kind of proud that doesn't show unless you look closely, which most people don't bother to do." She paused. "You have been looking closely." He said nothing. "What did you do?" his mother asked. "Nothing." "What did you say?" The word landed with a precision that was almost physical. Nathaniel sat with it for a moment, turning it over, feeling the specific weight of it. "Nothing I did not mean," he said finally. His mother looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her embroidery again. "Then the question," she said quietly, "is whether you still mean it." He left without answering her. He told himself it was because he had work to do. He had been telling himself a great many things lately that he almost believed. Margaret Ellison arrived at 2:30 with her mother, a hired driver, 3 trunks of luggage for a 2-night visit, and the kind of entrance that made every person in the room rearrange themselves slightly without quite knowing why. She was beautiful in the way that expensive things are. Beautiful, precise, deliberate, assembled. Her dress was the right color. Her hair was the right style. Her manners were impeccable in the way that manners are impeccable when they have been practiced long enough to become weaponry. She greeted Mrs. Reed with warmth. She greeted Nathaniel with something that was not quite warmth, but performed it well enough. She greeted Clara, who had been crossing the entrance hall with Thomas's afternoon assignment when the party arrived, and had not had time to retreat with a smile so pleasant and so perfectly calibrated that Clara felt it on her skin like something cold. "Miss Whitcomb," Margaret said. "The companion, yes, Mother mentioned you. How lovely that you've settled in so well." "Thank you, Miss Ellison. You must find it quite a change from Pennsylvania." The way she said it wasn't cruel. It was something more sophisticated than cruel, an acknowledgement of difference dressed up as sympathy. "Such a smaller world. I imagine Reedmont feels very grand." "It's a fine estate," Clara said. Her voice was even. "If you'll excuse me, I have a student waiting." She walked away. She did not allow herself to hurry. Thomas's lesson that afternoon lasted longer than it needed to, because Clara had nowhere else particular to be that did not risk running into the Ellison party, and because Latin declensions, as it turned out, were an excellent thing to focus on, when the alternative was thinking about the way Margaret Ellison had said the companion, yes, in that tone of perfect social placement, not dismissive, never dismissive, just orienting, just making sure everyone in the room understood exactly where everyone else stood. Clara understood exactly where she stood. She had always understood. That was the thing people misread about her. They looked at her composure and assumed she was indifferent to social reality, or unaware of it, or too naive to feel its edges. She was none of those things. She understood the structure very clearly. She had grown up inside it. She knew what she was in this house, and in this county, and in this world. And she had made a kind of peace with it long before she ever arrived at Reedmont. It was only lately that the peace had started to feel less like acceptance and more like a door she had locked from the inside. She was drilling Thomas on his accusative plurals when she heard voices in the corridor. Margaret's voice bright and carrying, and beneath it, lower Nathaniel's. She did not look at the door. "Agricolam?" she said to Thomas. "Agricolam," Thomas repeated, looking at the door. "Eyes here." He looked back at her. "Agricolae, wait, that's genitive, isn't it? It is. Good. Again." The voices in the corridor moved past. She heard Margaret laugh at something, that particular laugh women use when they want a man to know he has said something charming, and then the sound faded down the hall, and Clara held Thomas's gaze and said, "Agricolas, accusative plural. Your turn." Thomas said it, correctly. "Good," she said. Again. She made him do it 6 more times. Hishag. Supper that evening was the worst meal Clara had sat through since she arrived. She ate in the household kitchen as always, which was not the problem. The problem was that the kitchen shared a thin wall with the dining room, and the wall did not share Mrs. Reed's gift for discretion. Clara could hear Margaret Ellison talking, not the words exactly, but the rhythm and temperature of it, the way her voice filled a room and organized it around herself, the way she laughed at the right moments and fell quiet at others. She could hear Nathaniel's voice, too shorter, less frequent. She could not tell if he was enjoying himself. She told herself she did not care. Dottie set a plate of cornbread in front of her and said, "She's pretty, ain't she? The Ellison girl." "She's very handsome," Clara said. "Reckon she and Mr. Reed will make a match of it." "I have no idea, Dottie. Cook says Mrs. Reed don't much like her." "Cook should mind her business," Clara said, and then because that was unkind, and Dottie was 17 and meant nothing by it. "I'm sorry, I'm tired this evening." Dottie nodded with the easy forgiveness of the young and went back to her pot. Clara ate her cornbread and stared at the wall and listened to a laugh she could not identify come through from the other side, and she thought with a clarity that was almost peaceful in its completeness. This is the correct outcome. This is exactly what makes sense. She is the right kind of woman for this house and this life and this man. She fits the shape of things. And you are here to teach a 9-year-old his Latin and go home when you are no longer needed. She thought it all the way through to the end. It helped almost not at all. She could not sleep. This had become a pattern. In the last week she would exhaust herself through the day, with work and purpose and careful avoidance. And then the night would open up, and there would be nothing to manage and nothing to focus on. And the quiet would come in around the edges of things, and she would lie in her small room with the window open to the summer night, and her mind would simply refuse to stop. At 11:30, she gave up on the attempt, wrapped her light shawl around her shoulders, and went to the North Library. She had discovered early in her time at Reedmont that the North Library was the safest room in the house at night. It was remote enough from the main bedrooms that the candlelight didn't disturb anyone, and Mrs. Reed had given her standing permission to use it whenever she liked. In the first weeks, she had used that permission often. In the last week, she had avoided the library because Nathaniel used it in the evenings. At 11:30, on a summer night with 2 guests occupying the main guest rooms, she calculated the probability of encountering him as low. She had miscalculated before. He was in the chair by the east wall, the one with the good reading angle, with a candle burning low on the table beside him, and a book she recognized. She had been the last one to read it 2 weeks ago, before everything had changed open in his lap. He looked up when she came in. She stopped in the doorway. Neither of them said anything for a moment that lasted approximately as long as a year. "I'll go," she said. "Don't." He said it before she could move. Not a command. Something more complicated. A request that hadn't quite decided if it was allowed to be one. "Please. The room is large enough." She stood in the doorway for another moment. Then she came in, went to the far shelf, selected a book she did not particularly want, and sat in the chair on the opposite side of the room by the window. She opened the book. She read the same line 4 times. "How is Thomas progressing?" Nathaniel said. "Well." She did not look up. "His accusative plurals are much improved. He told me you were a hard teacher. He is 9. He tells everyone that every teacher is hard. He also told me," Nathaniel said, "that you were the best one he'd had." She looked up at that. She hadn't meant to. He was watching her with that expression she couldn't name, the less managed one, the one she had seen through the window on Friday night. He had the book closed now in his lap, his thumb marking a page he had probably not been reading either. "He's a smart boy," she said carefully. "He does the work himself." "Clara." He used her given name. He had not done that before, always Miss Whitcomb, always the correct address. The sound of it in his voice did something she had no defenses prepared for, because she had not anticipated the attack coming from that direction. She looked back at her book. "Miss Whitcomb," she corrected quietly. A pause. "Right." Another pause longer. "Will you tell me what I did?" "You did nothing. I have said so." "You have said so 3 times. And it has been less convincing each time." He leaned forward slightly in the chair, elbows on knees, the book set aside. I don't pretend to be a man who reads situations with any great ease. I spent 6 years in a militia, and 3 years after that learning how to run an estate, and neither of those things teaches you much about this, about people, about women." He stopped. "About why a woman who was easy in this house for 5 weeks is suddenly not." Clara's hands were very still on her book. "What changed?" he said. "Tell me plainly." She could feel the specific weight of the choice in front of her. She could keep deflecting. She was good at deflecting. She had been deflecting since Tuesday, with a consistency she was actually rather proud of. She could do it again. Now produce another polite, smooth, appropriate non-answer, and watch him accept it because he was too decent to push harder. Or she could tell him the truth. She had not planned to tell him the truth. "I was in the corridor," she said. "On Tuesday, the week before last. I was bringing tea to your mother." He went very still. "I heard you," she said. "I did not mean to. I want to be clear that I was not listening at doors. I simply stopped at the wrong moment, and I heard you say what you said." The room was very quiet. "And then I finished my work," she said, "and I decided to behave accordingly." He didn't speak for a long moment. She looked up finally, because the silence had gone on long enough that she needed to see his face. He was looking at her with an expression that she could not immediately categorize, not embarrassed, not defensive, not the polished control he usually wore. Something more stripped than that. Something that looked like a man encountering his own words from the outside for the first time and not being entirely sure what to do about them. "I meant it," he said. when I said it. I know you did." She kept her voice gentle. She had not expected to feel sorry for him, and the feeling was inconvenient, but it was there. "You do not owe me anything different. I want to be clear about that. I am not saying this to make a claim on you. I am saying it because you asked me plainly, and you deserved a plain answer. Clara, Miss Whitcomb." "Miss Whitcomb?" He said it this time without quite agreeing to it. "What you heard me say, I was describing something true about myself. I was not—" He stopped, tried again. "I have not been dishonest with you." "I know, but I—" Another stop. Longer. He picked up the book from the table beside him and set it back down again, a small, restless gesture she had never seen from him before. "When you stopped looking at me. When you stopped being the way you were before." He pressed his mouth together briefly. "The house changed." She looked at him. "That is not an explanation," she said. "That is an observation." "I know." He looked at his hands. "I am trying to work out what it explains." The candle between them was burning low. Outside, the summer night pressed softly against the glass. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck the quarter hour. "You should sleep," Clara said. It came out quietly without the professional edge she had been trying to maintain. Something closer to care than she had intended. He looked at her. "So should you." "Yes." She stood carefully and set the unread book back on the shelf where she had found it. She straightened her shawl. She was almost to the door when he spoke again. "It frightened me," he said. "When you stopped, the not knowing why." A pause. "I don't frighten easily." She stopped walking. "That is not nothing," she said without turning around. "No," he said. "I don't reckon it is." She stood there for a moment with her hand not quite on the doorframe, feeling the exact dimensions of what was being left unsaid in the room behind her, and then she walked out before she could make the mistake of turning around and reading something into his face that she was not yet prepared to believe. She made it to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed in the summer dark, and she held her own hands together in her lap, and she told herself very firmly that one conversation in a library did not change anything. He had said it himself. I meant it. That was the sentence that mattered. Not the one that came after. Not the small, careful admission that the house had changed. Not the word frightened spoken in his voice in the dark about her. The sentence that mattered was, I meant it. She was not going to be foolish. She was not going to rebuild something from one midnight conversation, and a man's restlessness, and a candle burning low. She was a sensible woman with a clear understanding of her own position. She was here to work. She lay down. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep for 2 hours. In the morning, Margaret Ellison came down to breakfast in a dress the color of morning sky, and sat beside Nathaniel with the ease of a woman who had been practicing that particular ease her whole life, and she said something that made Nathaniel's mother produce a very slight smile with her eyes, only the kind that did not mean amusement. Clara brought Thomas down for his breakfast at the household table, and did not look into the dining room. She was pouring Thomas his milk when she heard Margaret's voice from the other side of the wall, warm and carrying, and aimed precisely. "Mr. Reed, I wonder would you show me the south orchard this morning? Mother says the peaches are remarkable this year." And Nathaniel's voice lower. "I have estate business until noon, Miss Ellison. My mother would be glad to—" "Oh, surely the business can wait an hour." A small, practiced laugh. "It is a beautiful morning." A pause. "I'll see what I can arrange." Thomas said, "Miss Whitcomb, you're overpouring." She looked down. She had filled his cup to the very brim. "So I have," she said. "I apologize." She set down the pitcher. She sat across from Thomas and helped him with his biscuit and kept her face entirely arranged. In the dining room, she heard chairs scraping back from the table, and Margaret saying something else, and the warm, self-assured music of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and had every social advantage to do it with. Thomas looked at her with the unnerving directness of children. "Are you sad?" he asked. "I am fine," Clara said. Eat your breakfast. You look like you did the time I got a wrong answer 6 times in a row and you kept making me do it again. How do I look? Like you're trying real hard not to feel something. He took a large bite of biscuit. That's what you told me. You said when a problem's hard and you want to quit, you're not really fighting the problem. You're fighting the feeling of the problem. You're supposed to let yourself feel it and then do the work anyway. Clara looked at this 9-year-old boy. She thought not for the first time that children had no business being that perceptive. Eat your breakfast, Thomas, she said. He ate his breakfast. She folded her hands in her lap under the table where he couldn't see, and she breathed in once very slowly, and she let herself, just for that one breath, feel the full size of what she was fighting. It was larger than she had been pretending. That was all right. She had managed large things before. She straightened her spine, looked at Thomas, and said, "Nominative singular, puella." "Puella," Thomas said. Again. She kept him at it until he had it perfect. Outside in the summer morning, she heard the back door open and footsteps cross the porch, 2 sets, one heavier than the other, and she did not look toward the sound. She did not look, but her hands flat on the table in front of her now were not entirely still. Margaret Ellison did not leave after 2 nights. She sent her mother back to the Ellison estate with the hired driver, and the 3 trunks kept 1 bag for herself, and informed Mrs. Reed over breakfast on Sunday morning that her mother had extended the invitation on her behalf. If it was not too great an imposition, she would be delighted to remain through the week. Mrs. Reed said it was no imposition at all, with a smile that reached precisely to the corners of her mouth and stopped there. Nathaniel said nothing. He was looking at his coffee. Clara heard about it from Dottie, who heard it from the cook who had been in the hallway at the time, and who had opinions about it that she shared freely with anyone within range. Clara received the information, thanked Dottie, and went to find Thomas for his Monday lesson with the particular posture of a woman who has decided that whatever she is feeling, it is not going to show in her shoulders. Her shoulders were very straight that morning. Margaret moved through Reedmont with the confidence of someone measuring a room for furniture she intended to order. She asked Mrs. Reed questions about the estate's history and listened with apparent interest. She praised the south garden. She complimented the quality of the silver at table. She was in every visible way exactly the kind of woman this house had been designed to receive: the right proportions, the right references, the right ease with the right kind of people. And she watched Clara. Not obviously, not the way an insecure woman watches a rival with open suspicion and too much attention. Margaret was considerably more sophisticated than that. She watched the way a chess player watches the board, cataloging, assessing, deciding which pieces required attention and which could be safely ignored. Clara was apparently not in the safely ignored category. She became aware of it on Monday afternoon when she was crossing the entrance hall with Thomas's geography books, and Margaret appeared from the sitting room doorway with a timing that felt less accidental than it looked. "Miss Whitcomb." The smile was warm. The eyes behind it were doing something else entirely. "I keep meaning to speak with you. Do you have a moment?" Clara had a Latin lesson in 7 minutes. "Of course. I wanted to say you are so good with the boy. Thomas clearly adores you." A pause that was not quite long enough to be rude. "It must be a comfort being useful in a house like this, especially given, well, the uncertainty of your situation." Clara looked at her. "My situation is quite stable, thank you." "Oh, of course. I only meant a companion's position is always somewhat dependent on the household's needs, isn't it? Circumstances change. Families change." The smile stayed perfectly in place. "I'm sure Mrs. Reed values you enormously. For now." The "for now" landed with the precision of a woman who had been practicing landings her whole life. "If you'll excuse me," Clara said. "Thomas is waiting." She walked to the lesson room without hurrying. She sat across from Thomas and opened the geography book and said, "Accusative plural. Puellum no wait. We covered that. Let's try something harder today." Thomas looked at her. "Are you angry?" "I am focused," Clara said. "There is a difference. Begin." She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself Margaret Ellison's opinion of her situation was the opinion of a woman with every advantage of wealth and position, and that such women had been narrating other people's smallness since the beginning of organized society, and that Clara Whitcomb had survived worse than a well-dressed woman making veiled remarks in an entrance hall. She told herself all of this very convincingly. And then on Tuesday evening she was alone in the North Library. She had checked twice that it was empty before entering, and she was 3 pages into the novel she had actually been trying to read for a week when the door opened and Nathaniel came in and stopped when he saw her. "I'll go," he said. Same words she had said the last time. "You don't have to," she said. Same answer he had given. Something about that symmetry seemed to land on both of them at the same moment, because he almost smiled. Not quite, but the edge of it, and she looked back at her book before it could do any more damage to her composure. He sat in the chair he'd occupied before. The room settled into a quiet that was not entirely uncomfortable, which was its own problem, because comfortable silence with a man was something she could not afford to get used to. "Miss Ellison seems to be enjoying her extended visit," Clara said, because the alternative was sitting there in silence, feeling things, and deliberate conversation was a known quantity she could manage. "She is a sociable woman," Nathaniel said. "She is very handsome." A pause. "She is. And accomplished. I understand she speaks French." "So I'm told." "She seems very suitable," Clara said. The word cost her something. She kept her voice even so the cost didn't show. Nathaniel set his book down. She could hear it, the soft sound of it against the table, without looking up. "Clara." Her given name again. She did not correct him this time. She was tired. "What are you doing?" "Reading." "You are listing a woman's qualities at me. Why?" She looked up. He was watching her with an expression that had gone past careful into something she could only describe as done pretending. "I am making a reasonable observation," she said. "You are telling me to look somewhere else." The accuracy of it hit her somewhere between the ribs. She held his gaze because looking away would be worse. "She is the right kind of woman for this house," Clara said quietly. "For this life. For what you told your mother you needed. Which is not love and not risk, and not someone who makes things complicated. She won't make things complicated. She knows the rules of this world, and she plays them with considerable skill, and she would manage this estate and this county and the whole social order of the Hudson Valley without disturbing your peace for a single day." She paused. "I am a school teacher's daughter from Pennsylvania, Mr. Reed. I teach your nephew his Latin. These are simply facts." The room was very quiet. "I have been courteous to many women," Nathaniel said slowly, like he was choosing each word with deliberate care. "I have showed the South Garden to women. I have sat at supper with women. I have made polite conversation and poured coffee and done every correct social thing that is expected of a man in my position with a great many women over the last 3 years. He stopped. "I have not crossed a dark house at 11:30 on a summer night because one of them looked like she couldn't sleep." Clara's grip on her book had gone tight enough that she could feel the binding pressing into her palm. "That does not mean—" she started. "I know what it means," he said. "I am still working out what to do with it, but I know what it means." He leaned forward slightly. "And I need you to stop explaining to me why it should be someone else." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at her book because there was nothing safe to say to that, and because the feeling in her chest had gotten large enough that she genuinely did not trust her voice to come out level if she tried. "Good night, Mr. Reed," she said. He didn't push. That was the thing about him. He had said what he came to say, and he was not the kind of man who needed to say it twice. "Good night, Miss Whitcomb." She left the library. She made it to the corridor. She stood with her back against the wall in the dark for a full 30 seconds before she trusted her legs to take her upstairs. Margaret found her in the garden the next morning. Clara had been walking the east path with her coffee cup in the early hour before Thomas's lessons, the 1 hour of the day that was reliably hers, when she heard footsteps behind her, and turned to find Margaret Ellison in a morning dress, looking fresh and deliberate, and entirely unsurprised to have found her there. "Miss Whitcomb." A warm smile. "How nice. I was hoping for a moment alone." The careful way she said it made the word alone sound like a warning dressed as good manners. "Of course," Clara said. Margaret fell into step beside her unhurried, and for a moment neither of them spoke. A bird called somewhere in the oak tree. The morning held its breath. "You are a clever woman," Margaret said finally. "I noticed that immediately." "Thank you. I mean it sincerely. You have managed your situation here with a great deal of intelligence." A pause. "Which is why I want to speak with you honestly, woman to woman, because I think you are too clever to need subtlety." Clara's hand was very still around her coffee cup. "Mr. Reed is a generous man," Margaret continued. "He is attentive to the people in his household. He asks questions. He notices things. He is the kind of man who gives attention freely as a matter of character, not as a matter of intention." She turned to look at Clara directly now, and her voice was not unkind. That was the worst part. It was the voice of a woman who believed she was being helpful. "I would not want you to mistake that attention for something that would change your circumstances. Men like Mr. Reed do not change a woman's station. They are simply generous, until they are not." Clara looked at her for a moment. "I appreciate the concern," she said. "I only want to—" "Miss Ellison." Clara kept her voice level. "Even. No edges showing. I understand my circumstances entirely. I have never been under any confusion about what I am in this house or what I am in this county. You may set your mind at ease." Margaret held her gaze for a moment. Something moved through her expression, not quite surprise, but its cousin. "Of course," she said pleasantly. "I meant no offense." "None taken." Clara smiled at her clean and direct. "Excuse me, I have a student at 8. She walked back toward the house at a pace that was not quite hurrying and kept her spine straight the entire way. She did not shake until she reached her room. She sat on her bed with her coffee gone cold in her hands, and she thought about what Margaret had said, and the more honest and difficult thing was, this Margaret was not wrong. That was the truth she could not argue past. Not the cruelty of it, it had not been quite cruel, but the accuracy. Men like Nathaniel Reed did not rewrite the social order because they had a sleepless night and an honest conversation in a library. Attention was not a promise. A man saying, "I know what it means" in a candlelit room at midnight was not the same as a man making a choice in the full light of day in front of his county and his neighbors and his world, choosing a woman the world would call beneath him. She had let herself despite everything. Despite the Tuesday in the hallway and 6 days of discipline and every clear-eyed conversation she'd had with herself about what she was and what she was not, she had let herself start to believe in something. That was the thing Margaret had done. Not broken anything. Just turned the light on so Clara could see clearly what she had already been building in the dark without admitting it to herself. She poured the cold coffee out. She pinned her hair. She went to find Thomas. For the rest of that day she was very, very efficient. The community gathering at the church on Friday was, as Dottie explained it to Clara on Thursday evening, less a religious occasion than a social one. The sort of summer assembly where the families of the county came together to see each other and be seen to exchange information about crops and marriages and politics and money in ways that were dressed up as fellowship. Mrs. Reed attended every year. Thomas attended because his mother, Mrs. Reed's daughter-in-law, who lived on the adjacent property, required it. Clara was asked to come along in her capacity as Thomas's companion. Nathaniel rode separately. Margaret rode with the Reed women in the carriage. Clara sat beside Thomas in the second carriage and watched the road and did not think about much of anything in particular. The gathering was held in the large room behind the church, and by the time the Reed party arrived, it was already full. Women in summer dresses, men in their best coats, children running and being corrected the particular hum of a community that had known itself a long time. Clara recognized a few faces from prior errands into the nearest town. She recognized none of them well enough to matter. She kept Thomas close and made herself useful, fetching his lemonade, straightening his collar, steering him away from the group of boys who were doing something inadvisable near the back fence. She was good at this. Being useful in the middle of a crowd was something she understood. You kept moving. You stayed purposeful. You made yourself an instrument of the occasion and not a participant in it, and nobody had any reason to look at you directly. She had almost made it to the hour mark when Margaret found her. It was not accidental this time either. Clara was standing with Thomas near the lemonade table when she heard Margaret's voice. That warm, carrying voice rise slightly above the general conversation nearby, aimed with the precision of a woman who had learned how to do damage in public while looking like she was simply talking. "Oh, she is delightful," Margaret was saying to Mrs. Patterson, a broad woman with a loud opinion about everything, which meant that whatever Margaret said to her would be general knowledge by sundown. Such a capable girl. The Reed family is so fortunate to have someone to manage the child's lessons. It must be such a relief for Mrs. Reed at her age to have a useful person in the house. Clara heard the pause around the word useful. She heard the work it did. Mrs. Patterson said something she couldn't catch, and then Margaret's voice again, lighter, half laughing. "Oh, I think she is quite content. These arrangements suit some women very well. Not everyone is meant for grander things. There is real dignity in knowing one's place, don't you think?" The room had not gone quiet. The conversation around them continued. Nobody was staring. It was all very polite, very civilized, and it had been aimed with complete accuracy at the one person in the room who was supposed to hear it and feel it, and stand there feeling it in silence. Thomas had gone still beside her. He was 9 years old, but he was not deaf and he was not stupid. "Miss Whitcomb," he said quietly, "is she talking about you?" Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she made a decision. She set down her lemonade glass, put her hand briefly on Thomas's shoulder, and walked the 12 steps to where Margaret Ellison was standing with Mrs. Patterson and 2 other women, all of whom saw her coming, and produced the particular social expression of people who are either about to witness something or hoping to avoid it. Margaret turned when Clara stopped beside her. Her smile did not falter. She was too practiced for that. "Miss Whitcomb," she said, warm as summer. "Were you looking for Thomas?" "Thomas is fine," Clara said. Her voice was even, quiet. Carrying only as far as the circle of women in front of her, she had no interest in a spectacle. But she was done. She was simply completely, cleanly done. "I wanted to speak with you." "Of course." "A woman's worth," Clara said, "is not measured by the chair society permits her to sit in." The warmth in Margaret's face arranged itself into something more careful. "I beg your pardon. You heard me." Clara kept her voice steady, not hostile, not performing for an audience, just true. "I am a schoolteacher's daughter. I work for my living. I have worked for it since I was 17, and I have done so with everything I have, and I have not once been ashamed of it." She paused. "I understand what you are doing, and I understand why you are doing it, and I am telling you plainly that it will not work the way you intend. Not because I am a threat to you, but because I am not the kind of woman who lowers her eyes." The 2 women flanking Mrs. Patterson were very still. Mrs. Patterson's face had done something complicated. Margaret said in a voice that had lost some of its warmth without quite becoming cold, "I was simply making conversation." "Yes," Clara said, "I know." And she smiled, not sharp, not triumphant, just real. "Enjoy the afternoon, Miss Ellison." She turned around. The room was not watching. That was the thing, she had managed it in a voice too low for general theater, and the gathering continued around her the way gatherings do, oblivious and self-involved. But in the small circle behind her, there was a silence that would become a story by evening, and Clara walked back to Thomas with her heart going hard and fast in her chest and her face entirely composed. Thomas looked up at her. "What did you say to her?" he whispered. "Something overdue," Clara said. "Drink your lemonade." He drank his lemonade. She did not look around the room. She did not look for Nathaniel. She was not doing this for an audience or for a man or for any purpose other than the one she had stated. She was simply done. She stood straight and breathed, and let the feeling of it settle, and she discovered with some surprise that it felt less like victory and more like relief, the particular relief of a woman who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally simply set it down. She did not know that Nathaniel had been standing 12 feet behind her. She did not know that he had heard every word. She did not know that he had gone very still at the first sentence she spoke and stayed that way through the last, or that something had shifted in his face during those 30 seconds that Mrs. Reed, standing 2 feet to his left, observed with the calm satisfaction of a woman who has been waiting a long time for the right kind of evidence. She did not know any of that. She knew only that Thomas needed more lemonade and that she was going to get it for him, and that her hands were completely steady as she picked up the glass. For the first time in 2 weeks, they did not have to work to stay that way. Nathaniel found her outside. She was sitting on the bench at the side of the church building where Thomas had asked to go, because the room had gotten loud, and Thomas was now occupied with a beetle he had found on the ground and was examining with the scientific focus of a boy who had momentarily forgotten all other concerns. Nathaniel sat down on the bench beside her without preamble. She looked at him. "How much did you hear?" she said. "Enough." He looked at Thomas, not at her. The boy hadn't noticed them yet. "You didn't have to do that." "I know. Margaret will. I know what Margaret will say." Clara kept her voice quiet. "I meant what I said to her. All of it. I am not frightened of the consequence." He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned and looked at her, and the expression on his face was not the careful stillness she had catalogued and memorized and trained herself not to read too much into. It was something else. Something she did not have a name for yet, but that felt in her chest. The way the first morning of a new season feels like something has shifted in the air and the world is not the same shape it was the day before. "I thought I knew what I needed," he said. "I thought I had it settled." A pause. "I was wrong." Clara looked at him. The summer light fell across them both on the bench, and Thomas's beetle escaped into the grass, and somewhere inside the church, someone was playing a badly tuned fiddle, and none of it mattered at all. "That is a large thing to be wrong about," she said carefully. "I know." He held her gaze. "I am acquainted with large mistakes. I generally address them directly when I find them." A beat. "Clara." Her name in his voice. She held very still. "Don't tell me to call you Miss Whitcomb right now," he said. "Just don't." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what Margaret had said in the garden. She thought about what he had said in the library. She thought about Tuesday in the hallway, and midnight conversations, and 6 weeks of trying very hard not to feel something she had been feeling anyway, and she thought about what she had just said inside to a room full of people she didn't know. A woman's worth is not measured by the chair society permits her to sit in. And she thought, "You said that. You said it and you meant it. Do you mean it for yourself?" "Nathaniel," she said. His name. The first time. Something in his face changed in a way she did not have words for. "We should go back inside," she said quietly. "Thomas has lost his beetle, and he is going to want my help finding it." He almost laughed. Not quite, but almost, and the almost of it was enough to rearrange everything. "Yes," he said. He stood. He offered her his hand from the bench, which was proper and ordinary, and correct, the kind of thing a man does 100 times for 100 women without meaning anything particular by it. She took it. Neither of them let go quite as quickly as they should have. Thomas looked up from the grass. "Did you find it?" Clara asked. "No," Thomas said. "But I found a different one. It's better." He held up a hand for their inspection. "I'm going to name it." "What are you going to name it?" Nathaniel asked. Thomas thought about it with great seriousness. "George," he said. Clara laughed, not the polite smile, the real one, the one that reached her eyes and changed the whole geometry of her face. She felt Nathaniel go still beside her. She did not look at him, but she did not stop laughing either. Margaret Ellison left Reedmont on Saturday morning. She did not make a scene of it. She was too composed a woman for scenes. She thanked Mrs. Reed with genuine warmth, said her goodbyes to Nathaniel with a smile that was graceful and undefeated, and communicated very clearly that she had simply revised her assessment of the situation and would be redirecting her energies accordingly. She nodded to Clara in the entrance hall, on her way out a small, precise nod, the kind that acknowledged a person without conceding anything, and she walked to the waiting carriage, and she was gone. Mrs. Reed watched the carriage from the window until it reached the end of the drive, then turned back to the room and said to no one in particular, "Well, that's settled." Nathaniel said nothing. Clara, who was crossing the hall with Thomas's assignment books, said nothing either. Thomas said, "Is she coming back?" "No," Mrs. Reed said pleasantly. "Good," Thomas said. "She smelled like too much rosewater." He looked up at Clara. "Can we do geography today instead of Latin? I want to find Pennsylvania on the map." "We can do both," Clara said, and steered him toward the lesson room before he could argue. Behind her, she heard Mrs. Reed say quietly to Nathaniel, "You have work to do." She did not hear his response. She closed the lesson room door and sat across from Thomas and opened the geography book and thought with considerable precision about nothing at all. The days after Margaret's departure had a different quality to them. Something had shifted in the house, not dramatically, not in any way that could be pointed to or named outright. But the air had changed the way air changes when a window that has been stuck closed for a long time is finally opened. The tension that Clara had been managing for the better part of 2 weeks did not disappear, but it transformed into something less exhausting. Less like armoring against an attack. More like waiting for a conversation that both people knew was coming, but neither had quite found the words for yet. Nathaniel found reasons to be in rooms she was in. He did not make it obvious, he was too careful a man for that, but she noticed, and she believed he knew. She noticed, and the fact that neither of them addressed it directly had become its own kind of language. He asked about her lessons with Thomas. He asked her opinion of the book she was reading. He left the north library window open on Tuesday evening, which he had never done before, and she understood that as an invitation, and went, and they sat across from each other for 2 hours reading their respective books, in a silence that felt for the first time like something being built rather than something being endured. On Wednesday, he asked her to walk with him to the South Field. Not Thomas, not his mother. Her. "I need to look at the east fencing," he said, which was plainly true, and just as plainly not the reason. She went. They walked the South Field in the late afternoon, and he explained the fencing problem, and she listened and asked 2 questions that made him look at her sideways, the way he did when she surprised him, and she thought, "I could do this for a long time. I could walk this land and listen to this man talk about his work and ask him questions and watch him look at me like that, and I could do it for a very long time and not get tired of it." She thought it, and then she thought, "Be careful," because nothing had been said, nothing had been decided. He had told her she was not someone he needed to look elsewhere from, and he had said her name in a room at night, and he had walked her to the South Field to look at fence posts, and she was still the companion, still the tutor, still the school teacher's daughter from Pennsylvania, and the world outside Reedmont had not rearranged itself simply because something was growing between them in the particular quiet of this summer house. She had learned at significant personal cost not to build on uncertain ground. She was careful. She was warm, but careful. She let herself be present without letting herself be unguarded. She walked back from the South Field with the summer evening gold around them, and she let herself feel in a contained and measured way how right it was to be there. She thought she was managing it very well. The letter from her brother came on Thursday. It arrived with the Morning Post addressed in Samuel's slanted handwriting that she would have recognized anywhere, the letters crowding each other, like he was always in a hurry, like the words were moving faster than the pen could keep up with. She picked it up from the hall table before anyone else could see the address and carried it to her room and stood at the window and opened it. It was not a long letter. Samuel had never been a man of many words when a few would do. "Clara Ellen is expecting again, God willing. And we are glad of it, though the house is full as it is. Mother's old room has been serving as the nursery since March. I reckon you know what I am saying." No hurry, we are not without sense, but when your position there comes to a natural end, it would perhaps be best if you had other arrangements in mind. I am sure a woman of your capabilities will manage. I know you always do. Your brother S. She read it twice. Then she folded it very neatly along its original crease and held it in her hands for a moment and looked out the window at the summer morning, at the green land of the estate that was not hers, at the sky that was impartial and enormous, and did not particularly care about the arrangements of Samuel Whitcomb's household. When your position there comes to a natural end, she was 26 years old. She had a good mind, strong references, and no permanent home. She had a brother who meant well, and an empty room that was needed for a child who was not yet born. She had learned to sew her own dress hems and manage household inventories and teach Latin to a boy who collected beetles, and none of those things added up to a life that belonged to her. She knew that. She had always known that. What she had not been fully prepared for was how much it would hurt to know it now in this house at this particular juncture. She tucked the letter into her apron pocket and went to Thomas's lesson. Why? She should have told someone. She knew that. She should have told Mrs. Reed or considered her options, or done any of the practical, sensible things a woman in her position would have done upon receiving that kind of letter. Instead, she taught Thomas his lessons and helped cook with the afternoon inventory and said nothing to anyone. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment. She told herself she needed time to think. She told herself a great many things, and none of them were entirely the truth, which was this: she did not want to say it out loud. Because saying it out loud made it real, and making it real meant that the thing she had been very carefully not building these last 2 weeks would have to be officially unbuilt, and she was not ready. She was not ready, and she was ashamed of not being ready, and the shame made her quieter than usual through the rest of the day. Mrs. Reed noticed. Of course she noticed. She was 71 years old, and she had been noticing things about people since before Clara's parents were born. "You've gone quiet again," she said to Clara that evening when Clara came to help her with the evening correspondence. "I'm tired, ma'am. You were tired last week, and you were not this quiet." Mrs. Reed looked at her over the top of the letter she was reading. "Is it a letter?" Clara's hands stilled on the paper in front of her. "Beg pardon." "The post came this morning, and Dottie said you took a letter upstairs before breakfast. I am not prying. I am simply observing that you have had a letter and you are quiet, and in my experience those two things are usually connected." Clara looked at her for a moment. Then she reached into her pocket and set the letter on the writing desk between them. Mrs. Reed picked it up and read it without a word. Her face did not change much. She had a lifetime's practice at that. But something around her eyes tightened slightly when she got to the second sentence, and she set the letter back down with a care that told Clara she understood exactly what it meant. "I see," she said. "I wanted to tell you properly," Clara said. "I have not yet determined them." "Stop." Mrs. Reed's voice was not unkind. "Don't start talking about arrangements. Not tonight." She looked at Clara steadily. "Does Nathaniel know?" "No." "Clara." "There is nothing for him to know," Clara said quietly. "It is a matter of household logistics, and I will address it appropriately. It has nothing to do with it, is simply a practical matter." Mrs. Reed looked at her for a very long time. "My dear girl," she said at last, and the gentleness in her voice was the most dangerous thing she could have deployed because it went right past Clara's composure and landed somewhere unprotected. "You have been managing practical matters your entire life. You have been useful and appropriate and sensible since the day you arrived in this house, and I have watched you do it with considerable grace. And I am telling you now that if you take that letter and make arrangements, and leave this house without saying a single honest word to my son, you will regret it in a way that practical matters cannot fix." Clara held very still. "He is not ready." "He has been ready since the 3rd week," Mrs. Reed said flatly. "He is simply a man, which means he is slower about knowing it than a woman would be. You gave him a deadline he didn't know about when you stopped looking at him. And you have been giving him evidence all week that you are not as untouchable as you were pretending." She paused. "The letter has moved that deadline. He needs to know." Clara said, "And if he..." If he does nothing, then you have your answer, and you leave with your dignity. But you do not make this decision for him by hiding a letter in your apron and quietly disappearing." She picked up her pen and returned to her correspondence, which was the unmistakable signal of a woman who had said what she intended to say and would not be adding to it. "Tell him, Clara, tomorrow. Don't be sensible about this one." She did not tell him the next morning. She told herself she would tell him at noon. At noon she told herself she would tell him at supper. At supper she told herself she would tell him after. She was very good at telling herself things. She was in the corridor outside the small parlor heading toward the stairs with the letter still in her pocket and approximately 6 separate arguments assembled in her head. For why tomorrow was a better moment when she walked around the corner and found Nathaniel standing in the corridor with a piece of paper in his hand. Her piece of paper. Her letter. She stopped. He looked up. His face was doing the thing it did when he was very still, but not calm. Something working behind his eyes, something that had been arrived at recently and was still settling. "It fell out," he said. "In the parlor, when you set down the inventory ledger. I picked it up because I thought it was the ledger page, and I read it before I saw the signature." He paused. "I'm sorry. I didn't intend to." Clara did not move. "It doesn't matter," she said. "It does matter." He folded the letter along its crease. He held it out to her. She took it and put it back in her pocket, and they stood there in the corridor, looking at each other in the summer evening dark. "Clara, your brother is telling you that your room is gone. I am aware of what the letter says. Where would you go? I would find a position. I have good references. Mrs. Reed would. Where would you go?" he said again, and the repetition of it was not impatience. It was the specific insistence of a man who wants a real answer and knows he is not getting one. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I have been working on it." He looked at her for a long moment. "You were going to leave," he said, "without saying anything." She opened her mouth, closed it. The accusation was accurate enough that she had no clean answer for it, and she was not going to lie to him. "I was going to speak with your mother about a proper... without saying anything to me." The emphasis was quiet, not angry. Something more difficult than angry, something that sounded like a man who has understood something and does not particularly like what he has understood. "Nathaniel, I told you to stop explaining to me why it should be someone else," he said. "And I thought you had. I thought after Friday, I thought..." He stopped, pressed his mouth together briefly. "Were you ever going to tell me?" "I did not know what to tell you," she said, and her voice came out less steady than she had planned. "You have not said anything. You have been kind and present, but you have not said anything, and I do not know what I am to you in this house, and I have a letter in my pocket telling me that I need to determine what I am in the world outside of it, and I cannot..." She stopped, drew a breath. "I cannot afford to wait for a man to decide if he wants me. I have never been able to afford that. It is a luxury that belongs to women with more options than I have." The corridor was very quiet. Nathaniel took one step toward her. She held her ground. "Then I'm saying it," he said. "Right now. I'm saying it plainly, so there is no confusion about it." He was close enough now that she could see the line of his jaw and the steadiness in his eyes and the particular quality of certainty in his face that she had only seen from him when he was talking about his land. The kind of certainty that is not bravado, but just truth. The way a man states a fact about something he knows completely. "Stay. Not as my mother's companion. Not as Thomas's tutor. As mine. As the woman I want beside me. As the woman I have been working out how to ask for every single day for the last 2 weeks while I was trying to remember how to be brave enough." She looked at him. Her heart was doing something she was not going to describe. "You told your mother," she said carefully, "that you had nothing left of that to spend." "I know what I told her." "You meant it." "I know I meant it." He did not look away. "I was wrong." A pause. "I have been wrong before. I know how to say so. I am saying so now." He exhaled once short through his nose, that small, restless tell that meant he was less composed than he appeared. I buried my wife 3 years ago, and I told myself that was the end of it, and I believed it, Clara. I genuinely believed it. And then you stopped looking at me, and I couldn't think straight for 2 weeks, and I started asking myself some questions I should have asked a lot sooner. He paused. I am not a man who talks about his feelings with any great fluency. I reckon you've noticed. I've noticed. Then I'll keep it plain. He met her eyes. I love you. It surprised me. I am not sorry about it. A beat. I would like you to stay. Ooh. The words landed in her chest in a way she had not been prepared for. Not because they were unexpected exactly, but because hearing it directly in his voice, in a corridor, with the summer dark pressing in at the windows, and his letter in her pocket, and 3 years of her own careful management, suddenly irrelevant. Hearing it directly was a different thing entirely from imagining it. She felt her eyes go bright. She was furious at herself about it. She was also not going to manage it in time. I'm frightened, she said. So am I. He said it without hesitation, like he'd already worked out that pretending otherwise was not something he was going to do. I'm frightened of getting it wrong again. I'm frightened of what this county will say, and what my position in it requires of me, and whether I have the right to ask a woman of your pride to navigate all of that. He paused. I'm frightened of wanting something this much. It's been a long time since I wanted anything this much. She looked at him. She thought about the hallway on a Tuesday afternoon in July, and a tea tray in her hands, and a sentence that had folded her whole heart, closed in 5 seconds flat. She thought about 6 weeks of trying to be invisible and useful and exactly correct. She thought about Margaret Ellison's careful cruelty, and Mrs. Patterson's wide eyes, and a room full of people, and the feeling of setting something heavy down. She thought about the specific way his name had sounded in her own mouth the first time she'd used it. You should know, she said, that I am not easy. I am not. I will not erase myself. I will not make myself small because it is convenient. I will say what I think, and I will argue when I believe I am right, and I will not change the essential shape of myself to fit what this county calls appropriate. The corner of his mouth moved. I know, he said. I need you to understand that. Before you. Clara, I know. And now he did smile small and real and direct. That is not a warning. That is the point. She stood there for a moment in the quiet of the corridor. Then she said, Ask me properly. He looked at her. Something moved through his expression, not surprise. Something warmer than surprise. He took a slow breath, and he straightened slightly, and he looked at her with everything managed and nothing hidden the way a man looks when he has decided to simply be exactly what he is, and trust that it is enough. Clara Whitcomb, he said, will you marry me? Not a question. Not because he was certain of her answer. She could see clearly that he was not certain, that he was waiting. That he was in that particular suspended moment of a man who has done the brave thing and is now in the hands of someone else's decision. Not a question, because he was a man who stated things plainly and directly, and he had stated this one. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought, be careful. The old instruction. And then she thought, you said it yourself. A woman's worth is not measured by the chair society permits her to sit in. Do you mean it for yourself? Yes, she said. His whole face changed. He had been still before, disciplined, and still and waiting. And then the stillness broke, and he looked like a man who has been holding his breath for 3 years and has only just remembered that he is allowed to stop. He reached out and took her hand. Both hands. He held them between his, and he looked at her with the specific clarity of a man seeing something for what it actually is. And she looked back with her eyes still embarrassingly bright, and her heart making absolute chaos of everything she had tried to keep managed. And neither of them said anything at all for a moment, because they were both for once simply in the thing rather than standing at the edge of it. I need to write to your brother, he said. I need to write to him first, she said. He will take it better if it comes from me. Fair enough. His hands were warm. He had not let go. What will you tell him? That his old room is needed for the new baby, Clara said, and I have found alternate arrangements. He laughed. Out loud, unguarded the laugh of a man who had forgotten he could do it. She felt it in her hands where he was holding them, and she thought with the clean certainty of something finally known, there he is. She had been watching for this version of him since the 3rd week. "I'll speak to my mother in the morning," he said. "She already knows." He looked at her. "She told me to stop being sensible about it," Clara said. Something crossed his face. "She told you. She told me not to disappear without saying an honest word to you." Clara paused. She was right. He looked at her for another moment. Then he shook his head slowly, not in disagreement. In the particular way of a man who has been gently outmaneuvered by the 2 most capable women in his orbit and is not entirely unhappy about it. "She is always right," he said. "It is one of her most aggravating qualities." "It is," Clara agreed. He was still holding her hands. She did not move to take them back. Above them, the house was settling into its night sounds. The floors, the beams, the old wood doing the quiet work of keeping things standing. Thomas was asleep in his room at the far end of the hall. Mrs. Reed had gone up an hour ago. The summer dark outside was warm and full of crickets, and completely indifferent to the fact that something had just ended, and something had just begun, in a corridor that smelled of old wood and beeswax candles. "You should sleep," he said. "You should too. I reckon I might actually manage it tonight." "Is that unusual?" "Lately," he said. "Yes." She looked at him. She thought when you stopped dreaming that was not peace. That was absence. Mrs. Reed had said it to him, and he had called it sufficient, and now here he was in the corridor holding her hands at 9 o'clock on a Thursday evening, with a look on his face that was the opposite of sufficient in every possible way. "Good night, Nathaniel," she said. "Good night, Clara." She went upstairs. She did not try to be sensible about the way she felt. Not tonight. Mrs. Reed had told her not to, and she had learned in the last 2 weeks that Mrs. Reed's instructions were worth following. She lay in her small room with the summer night at the window, and the letter from her brother folded on the nightstand, and the full weight of the day settling around her. And she thought about what had just happened in the corridor, and she thought about what came next, and she thought about the county and the social order, and all the things Margaret Ellison's world would have to say about a school teacher's daughter from Pennsylvania marrying into the Reed name and this estate. She thought about all of it. And then she thought a woman's worth is not measured by the chair society permits her to sit in. She had meant it when she said it. It was time to mean it all the way down. She closed her eyes. For the first time in 2 weeks, she slept without having to work at it. The news moved through the county the way news always moves through small communities, faster than anyone intended, and with considerably more embellishment than the facts required. By Friday morning, Dottie knew. By Friday noon, the cook knew. By Friday evening, the woman who ran the dry goods in town had formed an opinion about it, and by Saturday, the opinion had acquired details that bore only a loose relationship to anything that had actually happened in a corridor on a Thursday night. Clara knew none of this on Friday morning. What she knew on Friday morning was that Nathaniel had been to speak with his mother before breakfast because Mrs. Reed came down to the kitchen where Clara was helping with the morning inventory and simply looked at her for a moment with an expression that was the closest thing to open emotion Clara had ever seen on that carefully composed face, and then she took Clara's hands in her own and held them and said, "Good," in a voice that was so simply and completely satisfied that it said everything the rest of the words didn't need to. "You are not surprised," Clara said. "My dear," Mrs. Reed said, "I have been waiting for this since the 4th week." She released Clara's hands and picked up her coffee with the composure of a woman who had returned to her natural state. "I was beginning to think I would have to be considerably less subtle." "You were not particularly subtle as it was." "No." A slight smile. "But I showed restraint." She paused. "Samuel will come around. Men like your brother always do when they understand the practical advantages." "It is not about practical advantages." "Of course not. But it will help him arrive at the right conclusion more quickly if he believes it is." She looked at Clara over the rim of her cup. "Welcome to the family, Clara. Now finish the inventory. The flower count was wrong last week." Clara finished the inventory. She was smiling the entire time. Ugh. Samuel's letter came 8 days later. It was longer than his first one. Samuel, it turned out, had considerably more to say when the subject warranted it. He said that he was surprised. He said that he hoped Clara understood what she was undertaking. He said that he trusted her judgment, a concession that cost him something she could tell by the way the sentence was constructed, and that he wished her well, and that Ellen sent her love, and that if the new baby was a girl, they were thinking of naming her after their mother. At the very end, in handwriting that was slightly less hurried than the rest he had written. I reckon you always did manage, Clara. I was just too slow to see it wasn't luck. She read that line 3 times. Then she folded the letter and went to tell Nathaniel it was done. The county had opinions. This was not a surprise. The county had opinions about everything: crop yields, church attendance, the correct number of children for a respectable family, the appropriate age for a widow to remarry, and certainly the appropriate social station of a woman who married into the Reed name. Clara had expected the opinions. She had in fact been preparing herself for them since Thursday night, running through the likely shapes of them, the way she ran through Latin declensions with Thomas methodically, completely, until she knew every form and had nothing left to be ambushed by. What she had not entirely prepared for was Mrs. Patterson. Mrs. Patterson found her at the market in town on the following Tuesday, in the company of 2 other women whose names Clara had learned, but whose expressions she had catalogued as unfavorable at the church gathering. The 3 of them bore down on her with the particular energy of women who have been discussing something and have now arrived at its source. "Miss Whitcomb," Mrs. Patterson said. Which was wrong already. She was not going to be Miss Whitcomb much longer, and the deliberate use of it had a texture to it. "We have heard the most extraordinary news." "I imagine you have," Clara said pleasantly. "You are to marry Nathaniel Reed." "I am." The 3 women looked at each other. Mrs. Patterson's expression did the thing it had done at the church, complicated, oscillating between social disapproval and something else she hadn't quite decided the name of. "Well," said one of the women, Mrs. Hart, a thin woman with sharp eyes and a sharper instinct for which way a conversation was going to fall. "He is a good man." "He is an excellent man," Clara said. "A man of considerable standing in this county," Mrs. Patterson said. The weight she put on standing was doing more work than the rest of the sentence. "Yes," Clara agreed. "I am aware." "And you are—" Mrs. Patterson paused, searching for a formulation that was not overtly rude. "A schoolteacher's daughter from Pennsylvania, who has been running your neighbor's household and educating their nephew for the last 2 months, Clara said, clear and unbothered. "Yes, ma'am. That's exactly right." Mrs. Patterson blinked. "Nathaniel Reed," Clara continued in the same pleasant and entirely direct tone, "is a man who knows his own mind. He made his choice with full knowledge of who I am and where I come from. I reckon the county can form whatever opinion it likes about the match. I also reckon that the county's opinion is not the thing that matters most to either of us." She smiled at Mrs. Patterson, and then at Mrs. Hart, and then at the 3rd woman who had been silent this entire time, and now looked like she was trying not to smile back. "Good morning. Give my regards to your families." She bought her flower and walked back to the carriage. Her hands were steady. She was getting better at that. She told Nathaniel about it that evening. They had developed in the last week and a half the habit of sitting together after supper in the south parlor, Nathaniel with his account books, Clara with her reading or her correspondence, the room settling around them in a comfortable quiet that felt less like proximity and more like belonging. It was the kind of domestic simplicity that Clara had not known she wanted until it was in front of her, and she was careful not to examine it too closely for fear of the examining itself undoing it. "Mrs. Patterson found me at the market," she said. He looked up from his ledger. "She had questions." "I imagine she did." A pause. "What did you say?" Clara told him close to verbatim. She had a good memory for conversation. When she finished, he set his pen down. He looked at her with that expression, the one she had catalogued as the less managed version of his face, the one she had stopped trying to read without bias, because her bias was now considerable, and she knew it. "You said he said. "I beg your pardon. You said the county's opinion is not what matters to either of us." His voice had a quality she had come to recognize, the particular quiet of a man who is moved by something and is choosing how much to show it. "You said us." She looked at him for a moment. "I did," she said. "Good." He picked up his pen. "I want you to keep saying it." She looked back at her book. She was smiling at a page she had not been reading. The wedding was planned for September. Mrs. Reed managed the arrangements with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had been waiting to manage them for some time and was thoroughly prepared. She consulted Clara on everything and overrode nothing, which was itself a statement in a world where mothers-in-law were generally expected to have opinions of the dominant variety. Thomas, when informed of the situation, thought about it for approximately 4 seconds and then said, "Does this mean you're staying?" And when Clara said yes, he said, "Good," in the exact same tone his great-aunt had used, which made Clara suspect that a particular quality of decisive satisfaction was simply a characteristic of the Reed family that ran deep. Nathaniel proposed formally a second time. He did it properly in the parlor in the presence of Mrs. Reed, because Clara had no father living, and her brother was in Pennsylvania, and someone ought to witness it, and Mrs. Reed was the obvious choice. He was not a man given to speeches, but he had prepared what he wanted to say, and he said it with the straightforward, unhurried certainty of a man who has thought about something very carefully and has arrived at his answer. He said he wanted to build something with her, not rescue her. He was clear on that. He said he understood the difference between offering a woman a position and offering her a life, and that he had no interest in offering her anything less than the latter. He said he had been wrong about a great many things in the last 3 years, and she had been the mechanism by which he'd discovered that, and he intended to spend the rest of his life being appropriately grateful for the inconvenience. Mrs. Reed, from her chair by the window, said, "That is the least romantic proposal I have ever witnessed, and also the most honest. Say yes, Clara." Clara said yes. The morning of the wedding was unremarkable in the way that important mornings often are, the world going about its business with complete indifference to the significance of what is happening in one small corner of it. The church at the edge of town. The same badly tuned fiddle, now considerably better tuned for the occasion. A gathering of neighbors and county families, some of whom had come with goodwill, some of whom had come with curiosity, and a handful of whom had come with residual reservations that they were keeping to themselves in the presence of the Reed name and the particular expression on Nathaniel Reed's face. That expression stopped more than one conversation before it started. He was not a man who threatened. He was a man who was simply entirely without performance or qualification, present standing at the front of that church with the look of a man who has finally arrived somewhere he didn't know he was headed and is not going to apologize for it. Clara walked in on Samuel's arm. Samuel had come. He had traveled 4 days from Pennsylvania, and he had arrived the evening before with Ellen's preserves and a bottle of good whiskey, and an expression that was half uncertain and half something Clara recognized from when they were children. The look he got when he was proud of her, but didn't quite know how to say it without it costing him something. In the vestibule before they went in, he'd looked at her for a moment and said, You look like yourself, Clara. Like the best version of yourself." She had taken his arm and said, "That's enough, Samuel. Don't make me cry before I've even started." He hadn't. He'd straightened up and walked her in with his shoulders back and his chin level, and she had felt in that moment a specific and uncomplicated love for her brother that had nothing to do with his faults or her frustrations, and everything to do with the fact that he had come. The vows were not long. Nathaniel had not written a speech. He was not a speech-writing man, and Clara would not have wanted one. What he had written were 4 sentences, and he said them to her in the voice he used when he was stating something true, not loud, not performing, just direct. "I vow to see you," he said. "Not your station, not your usefulness, not what this county calls appropriate. You, the woman who walked into my house and refused to disappear even when she was trying her hardest to." He paused. "I vow to be worth looking at." The last sentence had not been in the 4 he'd planned. She could tell. It arrived slightly differently with the quality of a thing that comes out because it is true rather than because it was prepared. She felt it in her chest like a struck bell. She had her own 4 sentences. She said them to him with her hands in his and her eyes clear, and the county of the Hudson Valley watching from the pews with whatever opinions it had assembled. I vow to never again call my own heart foolish simply because the world finds it inconvenient. I vow to argue with you honestly and mean what I say and say what I mean. I vow to build with you rather than merely live in what you have built. She paused. And I vow to keep looking at you even on the days when you make it difficult. He almost smiled. She did smile. In the front pew, Mrs. Reed sat with her hands folded in her lap, and the expression of a woman whose work here was complete. In the row behind her, Thomas sat with his good coat on and his hair flattened into submission, and a look on his face that was 9 years old and complicated. And finally, when Clara said her last vow, broke open into a grin he couldn't quite contain. Samuel beside Clara now made a sound that was not quite a cough. The minister said what ministers say. Nathaniel looked at her. She looked at him. And something that had started in a hallway on a Tuesday afternoon in July with a tea tray and a sentence that was supposed to close a door finished itself in a church on a September morning by opening one instead. The county adjusted. It took the better part of a year, which was faster than Clara had anticipated and slower than Nathaniel had patience for, but it adjusted. Human communities always do. They resist the new thing, and then they incorporate it, and then they cannot quite remember what they thought was so alarming about it in the first place. By the following spring, Clara Reed was a known quantity in the social order of the Hudson Valley. She was direct. She was educated. She had opinions, she stated plainly, and would argue for with a composure that some people found formidable, and others more perceptive, recognized as the specific composure of a woman who had learned very early that if she was going to take up space, she had to be certain enough to hold it. Mrs. Hart, the thin woman with sharp eyes from the market encounter, called on her in April and stayed for 2 hours and left having reconsidered several of her initial positions. That was the one that mattered because Mrs. Hart's positions tended to become the county's positions within a season. Mrs. Patterson remained reserved. Clara was not troubled by Mrs. Patterson. The first real test came in the form of a letter from the Ellison family, not from Margaret, but from Margaret's mother, who wrote to Mrs. Reed in the autumn to express her continued regard and to mention somewhat pointedly that Margaret had become engaged to a gentleman from Connecticut with excellent prospects. Mrs. Reed read the letter at breakfast and said, "How nice for her," in a tone that indicated she had no further thoughts on the subject. Nathaniel said nothing. Clara, who had been pouring coffee, set the pot down and looked at him across the table. He looked back. Something moved through his expression that she recognized that particular quality of a man taking stock of the distance between where he is and where he might have been. "Connecticut," he said. "Apparently," Clara said. "Reckon she'll be happy there." "I reckon she will," Clara said. "She is a practical woman. She'll make it work." He looked at her a moment longer. Then he went back to his breakfast. "Good coffee this morning," he said. Clara sat down. "I'll tell Cook," she said. Tag. The twist that neither of them had planned came in February. Clara had been feeling unwell for 3 weeks before she allowed herself to name it. She had been attributing it to the winter cold, to the adjustment of the household schedule, to any number of sensible and unrelated causes. She had been, in other words, being sensible about it. She told Nathaniel on a Thursday evening in the south parlor, in the same room where they had developed the habit of sitting together with his account books on the table, and her letter writing abandoned beside them. She said it plainly, because she had promised to say what she meant. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then Nathaniel Reed, who had sat through militia campaigns and financial crises, and the specific particular hell of 3 years of quiet grief, without once to anyone's knowledge losing his composure, put his face in his hands. Not in distress. The sound that came out of him was something she had never heard from him before. Something unguarded and unmanaged and completely full. She reached across the table and put her hand on his arm. He raised his head. His eyes were bright in a way she had no prior data for, and she filed it away, the image of this man at this moment, with the specific certainty of someone archiving something they intend to keep for the rest of their life. "I am frightened," she said. Because she was, honestly and completely. "So am I." He covered her hand with his. Same words as the corridor, same honesty. "I was frightened the first time, too." He paused. "Eleanor." "I know," she said softly. "I am not. It is not." He stopped, tried again. "I am not comparing. I know you're not." He looked at her for a long moment. "We will be all right," he said. Not as a promise, as a man talking himself towards something he is choosing to believe. "We will be careful, and we will be all right." "Yes," she said. She meant it. She had learned in the last 8 months that meaning things all the way down was the only version worth doing. Church. Their daughter was born in October. She arrived in the early morning with the harvest smell of the season coming through the window, and Thomas asleep in the chair in the hallway outside, refusing to go to bed until he had news, and Mrs. Reed sitting in the corridor with her hands in her lap, and an expression of focused intention, as though willing a good outcome was a task she could manage by sheer force of character. She was small and loud and entirely certain of her own importance, which Nathaniel observed within the first 5 minutes, and which Clara found in her exhausted and overwhelmed state the funniest thing she had heard in recent memory. "She's going to argue," Nathaniel said, looking at the baby with an expression that was not any version of his face she had catalogued before, something entirely new, something she was going to spend years getting to know. "She is absolutely going to argue," Clara agreed. "Reckon she gets that from somewhere." Clara looked at him. He was smiling, wide open and unmanaged and completely entirely real. She thought, there he is. The way she had thought it that day in the churchyard over a beetle named George. The way she had been thinking it in one form or another since the 4th week. "Thomas wants to name her," she said. "I know. He told me 6 names on the way in." "What were they?" "3 of them were names of states." He paused. "He is very committed to geography." Clara laughed until she had to stop, because her ribs protested, and Nathaniel sat down on the edge of the bed, and held her hand, and held the baby, and looked at both of them with the specific look of a man who cannot quite believe his own luck, and is choosing very deliberately to believe it anyway. Years later, enough years that Thomas had grown into a young man with strong opinions about agriculture and a fondness for his Aunt Clara that he expressed through argument. Because he had learned from long observation that she enjoyed a good argument. Nathaniel and Clara sat together in the North Library on a winter evening. A fire, her book, his account books. Their daughter asleep upstairs, 6 years old, and already managing the household with the particular authority of a child who has been told she can say what she thinks and has taken this entirely to heart. Clara looked up from her book. "When did you know?" she asked. He looked up. He didn't ask what she meant. After this many years, he rarely needed to. He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about everything, with the full weight of his attention unhurried. "When you stopped looking at me," he said, "the whole house went colder." He paused. "I thought it was the season. It was July." She looked at him. "I knew then," he said. "I just didn't know what to do with it yet." "It took you 2 weeks." "It took me 2 weeks," he agreed without apology. "I heard you tell your mother you had nothing left to spend," she said. "I was wrong." "You have said so before." "It keeps being true." He picked up his pen. "I was wrong, and you walked out of a library rather than let me see it on your face, and I spent 2 weeks looking for you in every room you weren't in." He looked at her steadily. "And I found you in all of them. That was when I knew." The fire between them had burned low. The house was quiet, the way it got in winter. A particular deep quiet, the quiet of a place that holds things safely. Their daughter was upstairs. Mrs. Reed was in her room. Samuel had written last week the new baby was walking. Ellen was well. Pennsylvania was cold. Clara looked at her husband across the library table, this careful, still slowly opening man who had told his mother he had nothing left to spend and had been wrong in the best possible way. And she thought about a Tuesday in July, and a tea tray in a corridor, and one sentence that had broken her heart in 5 words. She thought about the house that had gone cold. She thought about the two of them choosing. "Good," she said. "I was getting tired of being invisible." He reached across the table, his hand over hers, warm and certain, and exactly where it belonged. "You were never invisible," he said. "That was the whole problem." Clara Reed looked at the man who had sworn he would never love again, who had been terribly and beautifully wrong, who had said, "I know what it means in a candlelit room at midnight," and meant every word of it, and she understood with the full and irreversible clarity of a woman who has stopped being careful and started being alive, that some hearts do not die after grief. Some people are not finished. And some women only begin to live the moment they decide once and completely and without apology that their heart is not a foolish thing, and that the world does not get to tell them otherwise.